It's anything that's not fiction.
So I think we'll get started here. So let me welcome everybody. Rob Atkinson, president of ITIF. First of all, I want to apologize for not having an AV system. This is the problem when you deal with different vendors and they screw this thing up and can't fix it in time to do an event. I don't know how hard it can be to do this, but it must be hard. So I think we will just vocally project, and I think it should be fine. If you can't hear, give us the high sign and we're moving forward. So I've had the pleasure of knowing Peter and Jonathan for longer than either of us, all of us want to admit. And there are really there aren't a lot of people in this field who've had as much experience as they have really at the thought leader / a great phrase by Don Schoen at MIT, if you ever know Don, the reflective practitioner. And they're certainly reflective, and they're not just academics who sort of sit in the ivory tower and pontificate and tell us what we ought to do. They're actually engaged quite deeply in the policy process, and so have incredible insights to add. And I was pleased when they sent me this book to look at and review and comment on, and Digital DNA, Disruptions and Challenge for Global Governance, because this is such an important issue. In fact, one could argue it's perhaps one of the most important global economic policy issues, and yet there's been very little systemic thought into it. It tends to be episodic. What are we going to do about cloud computing and data localization? What are we going to do about Privacy Shield and EU-US privacy ownership? What are we going to do about malware and cryptography, all these things? What are we going to do about Department of Justice access to emails in Ireland? These are all important tactical questions, but unless they're guided by an overarching framework that is intelligent and logical, we're not going to get anywhere. And I've been frustrated by the fact that I don't think the U.S. government has done a very good job of this. They've been, to me, the last three administrations, current, and you can't really say it because they're still getting their feet under them. But certainly the Obama and Bush administration, they were tactical. They didn't have a strategic approach to this other than some broad framing of open internet, which I don't know what that really means, and I don't think that is the framework that's going to have us go forward. So that's why I was so pleased to see this book, because it is an attempt to say, this is a big deal. This is reshaping the global economy, and we're not really structured both intellectually or organizationally or institutionally in how to deal with it. And Peter and Jonathan laid this out in a very compelling way, so I encourage you all to buy the book and read it. Or I always say, just buy the book, you don't need to read it, right? So let me introduce them both. I'm going to do the short bios from the book jacket. Peter Cowhey is the Dean and Qualcomm Chair of Communications and Technology at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He served in a number of different international economic policy positions in the Obama and Clinton administration, including at USTR in the Obama administration and the FCC and Clinton. He's the vice chair of the Grameen Foundation and the California School on Science and Technology. Many articles written. Peter and I also have the honor and pleasure of working together on the President Obama's U.S.-China Innovation Experts Task Force. So we spent a lot of time bumming around China, enjoying.
Or not enjoying.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Jonathan Aronson is the professor of communications at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. He's also a professor of international relations at USC. He was the co-founder and director of the Annenberg Research Network on International Communication and served as the president of the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. Again, a distinguished scholar, written many books and articles on this topic. So I'll turn it over to Jonathan. Go first. Okay.
I'm good. Academics, we've tried to break the habit, but academics talk in 50 and an hour and 20-minute bites. Today, we're going to go much shorter than that because we see this much more as a conversation than as a lecture to you. You guys all know what's going on the ground. We're trying to provide some framework. Some background, we worked a lot on different books trying to figure out sort of where do you go with ICT, the trade and services, the trade policy. Generally, have done some other books. This particular project grew out of a project that we originally worked with Charlie Firestone, who just snuck in at the Aspen Institute.
And Gary.
Oh, Gary, I didn't see Gary. Hi, Gary. It got very ambitious and it didn't quite come together. Part of it was a question of ripeness. I'm not sure we're ripe now, but we think that at this time it's still an important issue to deal with. Let me sort of touch a little bit on sort of some of the big takeaways, and rather than playing too much tag team, Peter's going to go through quickly the deck that we have assembled. This deck, you don't have to take any notes. It's going to be posted online at the ITF site, and you are most welcome to refer to it going forward. The first part of the book really deals with changes that 5 years ago were not as accepted about both the disruption of information and production processes. And we make the distinction between information and production. Okay. Processes and how these changes have affected innovations, clusters, and business models across the board, not just in the telecom or information industries, also in the service industries more widely, and also in manufacturing. So we were with folks who were manufacturers last night in part, and they said, well, of course, you can't be a contemporary manufacturing industry without taking into account all of the information disruption and opportunities there. There's some new issues that we haven't dealt with before, which we're needing to deal with. A large part of the second part of the book has to do with things like the cloud ecosystem, privacy, cybersecurity, and the market access that is required to create trusted digital environments. Unlike many academics are trained from the beginning to say why something didn't work, doesn't work, won't work, couldn't possibly work. We go in a somewhat different perspective, as Ralph has suggested. We're much more interested in how do you get something that's better than where you're at. We have no illusion that everything we say is going to happen as we say it. We are not futurists, but we try to lay out a framework of how one could proceed. There will be mistakes, but it also provides a basis for going forward. One of the aspects of that is that you're going to need a like-minded core club of nations to put together to forge a governance regime. This, at the present time, may be the most difficult issue that we face. We're finding that a lot of people are accepting that the world has changed, the business models have changed, the economies have changed. But how to then go forward is one of the real challenges that we all face. And we put forward a perspective on how to go about that uses both hard law and soft law. And Peter's going to talk more about what we mean by that, sort of political sciencey, regulatory speak, but it is also quite important of how do you actually craft and put together a coalition and a set of and a framework for dealing with that. Rather than confusing you and going back and forth, and I'll come back in the Q&A, let me turn it over to Peter.
Well, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks especially to Rob and ITIF for having us today. Rob, thanks for that great quote for the book. We were talking earlier that if it hadn't been good, we would have had to say that the cover was just too limited in space. But he made the cut in fulsome praise, so we're really grateful for that. You'll also, if you read the footnotes in the book, discover that we stole a lot of material from ITIF because ITIF has been thinking about many of the issues at the micro policy level and also in terms of thinking about what is the nature of the change in the global economy that we're exploring. Most of you understand everything that's on this slide, so I'm not going to spend much time on it, except to try to emphasize that we began with the notion that there are some fundamental technological drivers. And those drivers, you don't have to be able to predict exactly how they'll work to understand that their intersection is in some very significant and rising in total significance over time. And that it's both traditional information and communications technology as we think about it, but also the intersection of it with production technology that is allowing for a whole new set of applications. The other thing to understand is that fundamentally it's becoming radically cheaper to incorporate digital inputs into every phase of global economic activity. And that is not some sort of minor jump. It's a long-term trend that is reshaping the world economy. So, what's that mean? First of all, it means that when we talk about dealing with the digital economy, we are really talking about dealing with the restructuring of the world economy for all goods and services, including, as I'll show you in a second, traditional manufacturing and commodity production. Secondly, that means in terms of the Trump administration's concerns, that there is no way that you can sustain a high value-added manufacturing or commodity base for the U.S. economy without actually taking advantage of the digital infrastructure advantages that the U.S. has at a global level. The third point is that for terms of governance, how we'll actually sort of see the rules, whether they're formal or informal, about the world economy. The distinctions between goods and services in high-tech and low-tech are going to blur. So the idea that we're dealing with information technology or e-commerce as a separate chapter is fine for certain types of architecting of solutions, but fundamentally we're dealing with the digital transformation that has to be accommodated across farming as much as across cloud computing. And two other implications that are just important to note. There's a great deal of time spent on the issue of competition policy in regards to information technology. This is a complex area. We're not going to dwell on it today, but it's important to recognize that digital technology and production technology is actually lowering the cost of innovation and successful entry. It does reinforce the dominant position in certain market niches of players, but it also opens a whole variety of entry strategies and ways of changing business models. And of course, at the end, the most important thing is that this is changing the capacity for productivity increases in the economy, and that means in the long term, wages and growth. So what do we mean by the fact that it's becoming pervasive? You go to your grocery store, you may see this machine. It's Minute Key. Minute Key has taken communications technology, robotics, and electronic payment systems, and you can have your key made by a robotic kiosk in your grocery store. It is basically taking one of the most traditional goods-making operations found in a hardware store and turning it into a digital manufacturing system. Fracking, key to the U.S. oil industry. Costs of fracking have declined in the last 10 years, last 5 years actually, due to robotics and information inputs by about 25 to 30%. That's why at current oil prices, fracking is yielding higher production levels. Great story in commodities. Iowa Agricultural Accelerator. One of the implications of the digital economy is that it's no longer going to be Boston, New York, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Seattle, San Diego, Austin as the places where you have technology clusters. Digital technology allows digital dynamics for innovation even in traditional industries, and that means that the places where we're going to see tech centers is going to be much more broadly spread. This is the Des Moines Agricultural Accelerator Prizes that came out of the fact that Iowa knows more about farming than anybody, and therefore with the cost of digital technology and production technologies changing, Iowa can suddenly become an accelerator of technology innovations built around farming. Here are a couple of pictures for you. A phenomics lab, that was a term that didn't exist 15 years ago. It's entirely digitally and allowed by sensors, computing, etc., to allow selective breeding of plants at a much faster rate with experimentation. On the right-hand side, cotton used to be sorted and qualified for quality assessment by hand. This is an entire digital application. You just feed the cotton in. Changes the cost of quality certification. And if you want to be in the high-end cotton business, that's an important cost factor. The intersection of production and information technology is opening whole novel network products groups. This is just simply a picture of some of the initial applications in biomedical. Here's a more radical picture. Medical sensor tattoos. You'll go in, you will have a paste-on tattoo with a stretchable battery. The sensors are built in, the radio transmitter is built in, and these will be multi-sensor guided monitoring systems for your body. So, if this is happening across the US and global economy, the question is, how do we start to deal with its full implications? And so, the 3 points we're going to go through in the rest of this presentation are really, first, that you have to answer the question of who is going to act and be leaders. Because if this becomes a global ragtag discussion at the UN General Assembly, nothing will get done, and nothing will get done in a way that we would find to be allowing the best possibilities of innovation. So who's the club through piecemeal reform to get to a new way of approaching it? Secondly, we have to, in thinking about digital technology, recognize that the upside of digital technology is also intertwined with some very fundamental, irreducible public policy problems. And two of the ones that are really most important for the purposes of policy are digital privacy and cybersecurity. Market access for digital technology, which is something many of you in this room spend your time working on professionally, is not sustainable at a meaningful level, in our judgment, unless we also start to build some level of what we call quasi-harmonization of digital privacy and cybersecurity rules around the world. Not to get uniformity, that's impossible, but to get to the point where some boundaries are set so that the problem is more manageable. And so our approach is to suggest that we package market access arrangements with arrangements to start that process of starting to bring some limited coordination of privacy and security rules. And that leads to the third point, which is the strategy we're going to lay out basically says, let's honor the fact there's going to be diversity in national policy, but establish some authoritative, and that's what, by that we mean enforceable in some form, baseline of rules to achieve this quasi-harmonization. When we talk about hard and soft, I'll just give you a quick example. A hard rule would be saying, no, you can't require source code to be disclosed as the basis for your entry into a market. That's a hard rule. Absolutely may not do this. It's very specific, period. Hard rule. A soft rule, for those of you who are friends of mine from the old FCC days and from USTR, was when we said in a WTO agreement on basic telecommunication services, there are some regulatory principles that anybody who joins this agreement has to adhere to. How they implement it is up to you in detail, but you're accountable for having a meaningful way of achieving this policy capability. Okay? So that's the basic conceptual difference. So who's the club? As Jonathan said, this may be, in some ways, right now, the hardest problem, starting here at home, because we don't know what the president really thinks about any of this in a meaningful way. But our view is that we have to think about not the next year or the next 2 years, but we need to think 4 and 8 years, because these are going to be hard changes, even with cooperative leadership. And it takes a while for people to build the case in their own mind, country by country, about why they have a reason why this might be okay, might even be advantageous. The shift to get a truly competitive global communications market to the degree that we have it today took from really the late 1970s to the mid 1990s. So these things don't come in single shots. They step with the intersection of the facts on the ground changing, that's the technology driving things, and people starting to reassess their interests as they look at it, and then starting to have some good ideas for people to think about, oh, here's a way that we might be able to do this a little differently that we could live with. So, underlying this, to show all of our cards, is the fact that a primordial issue for all of U.S. companies, but for that matter for all the countries associated with the OECD, is what to do with China and the impact of the China model on the world. And there is a long and worthy policy debate. Rob has been very prominent in it about specific actions that might be taken to try to change Chinese behavior on specific issues. But you can't beat something with nothing. And in the long term, what there has to be is a way of organizing a significant part of the world economy that is important to China around ground rules that the Chinese have to know are meaningful for those markets. And so what we are trying to do is build a club that doesn't have built into it that China can never join, but a club that is meaningful in what it is doing, that China has to calculate that. And most importantly, Chinese technology companies have to calculate about what it means for their interests in the long term. That club is conceivably possible with the current market base of the NAFTA nations, the European Union, and some of the countries that were engaged in TPP, and of course Korea. They still represent more than 40% of the world economy. That's more than China and India combined. They have an even larger share of the actual information and communications technology market. It's not that they can ignore China. China's the fastest growing single market, but these countries have an enormously powerful market. We've, of course, walked away from TPP, and that enormously complicates this task as a beginning point, but NAFTA is the next point to start thinking about as a possible grounds point. Europe is an important open issue that we can return to later in discussion. So, this basically says that we've done it before, that we have evolved the world economy rules in regards to fundamental changes, whether it's telecom or services, and moreover, the last bullet point is the one to pay attention to. We've found ways of bringing other types of players into trade systems of governance. The easiest way to think about this is the role of technical standards organizations in trade agreements. These are really bottoms-up expertise groups that if they weren't working reasonably well, none of the trade rules involving technology would work decently, right? So we already know that it's important to incorporate these types of groups for certain well-defined roles recognized within the formal government rules for trade and regulation. Can you imagine, for those of you who are veterans of the FCC, if the FCC really had to certify every individual piece of equipment in detail that was attached to the network? No, we have rules about how they get certified. So, we want to build a regime. I don't want to talk about this in academic terms for long, but I do want to stress that it's important that a regime is more than the formal government rules that you enforce by a complaint process. It also is a way of starting to build an expectation among the parties that this is more or less how you expect reasonable people to behave and what is a range of acceptable behavior. And it's not that there isn't a lot of strategic gaming in the system, but that you're setting a sort of sense of expectations about how things kind of work. And then within it, you have a more formal oversight and accountability. Underlying any approach, and again, we're stressing that we want to talk about long-term building of an approach to putting these pieces together, is something that we call the face governance principles. And all these are, in a way, is a way of saying that this technology is so dynamic and the changes it's making in the economy are so deep, blurring the lines between goods and services, for example, that if you try to put it all in a box of formal government rules, which is one of the things the EU tends to do, it isn't going to work. And it's not going to work because it isn't flexible enough, it isn't experimental enough to get you to the point where you can evolve your understanding of arrangements. So that philosophy has to sort of be built in from the start. The book goes through a number of examples, whether it's privacy or cybersecurity or cloud computing, about why this approach is necessary, and shows, among other things, why, despite the reluctance of, well, let's say, critics of government in the US who think that government is intruding too much, you're not going to solve the core issues, for example, about digital privacy, without some degree of government intervention in the market. They simply have market failure problems that you can't overcome spontaneously. That doesn't mean that the regulation has to be heavy-handed. It does mean it has to have some appropriate boundaries. The other point is, and this speaks to our friends, for example, in Europe, is that regulation is costly. And one of the chief problems with trying to lay down a strict set of guidelines for privacy is that it can actually stop the marketplace experimentation that would simplify the problem. Many of the problems that we have tied to privacy, for example, are due to the lack of privacy property rights for individuals. But those are going to be invented by trial and error in the marketplace, and then government can backstop. Same thing for cybersecurity, same for the cloud. The book deals with this in separate chapters. So what do we need as an approach? Here's what we're proposing. That we think of a system that links together trade agreements, regulatory cooperation among national regulatory agencies, and a recognized role built into the process for multi-stakeholder expert groups as the three intersecting issues. So, for example, if you could think about privacy and as, or let's say security as an example, if a company wanted to be certified that it meets certain cybersecurity policy guidelines, then you could have the recognition of an organization like the Underwriters Labs and its counterparts to do certification under rules agreed upon among the regulators of the club, that this constitutes a legitimate testing organization. And the national regulators could have a right to specify a reason why they declined to accept it, but the presumption would be that they should. And if they did decline, they'd have to explain why, and they could be held accountable in trade enforcement if they failed, if they didn't have a good explanation that was capricious. It would violate the non-discrimination rules. So here are 6 minimum rules for the trade agreements that we think ought to be there. We have many more in the book, but here are 6, and then I'll get to trusted environment. The first couple are going to be familiar to all of you who are trade aficionados. They're already in our TPP, and I think they'll be in the NAFTA agreement if we do get an NAFTA agreement. The right to choose your location of your cloud ecosystem infrastructure across countries, the right to have free cross-border information flows subject to reasonable regulation, freedom of suppliers to locate infrastructure, and along with that, ban discrimination against electronic delivery of services, including software, and that would also incorporate allowing cross-border payment systems for services subject to some prudential financial regulation. These are sort of standard fare nowadays in discussion. Third and fourth are also, third is certainly basically an extension of what we have on telecom trade agreements today, recognizing that people have a right to use extraterritorial suppliers of services via public telecom networks. And the second part is technology neutrality in the organization of the service. And that is important for cloud infrastructures so that governments don't say that the cloud has to be organized by a certain infrastructure in order to deliver security, right? Instead, it's like we have for safety rules for interconnection with public telecom networks. You've got to guarantee no harm to the network, but it's up to you how you do it as long as you achieve that guarantee. The fourth is to recognize the use of international standards for encryption technology and the right of firms to use encryption for commercial purposes if they qualify as data controllers within rules for privacy and security. This is a pretty good example of what we mean by the intersection of regulation, multi-stakeholder groups, and trade agreements. So this says, in effect, that if Qualcomm is providing cloud services for medical devices, that you have a right to encrypt that data if it flows across national borders, as long as Qualcomm has been certified by a multi-stakeholder organization recognized under the trade rules as qualifying, that says you've met the privacy rules. It's up to you. But notice, this is not a blanket opening to people to use data encryption. It's got to be from a company that is within the club, subject to the rules. Fifth and sixth. The fifth is saying that we should build on the notion of the technology agreements that we already have to expand them. And here's the example to think about. If you remember, let's see back here, this picture. What is that? Is that a good? Is it a service? It's software loaded on sensors on a communications platform that's feeding into the cloud for an algorithm that's monitoring your behavior and your health condition. Is it a good? Is it a service? It certainly isn't covered by the information technology agreements today, but this is basically an information device with medical applications, right? So we need to find ways of relaxing these boundaries in two dimensions. One, what is the range of what we cover under special considerations for digital products? And number two, we have to recognize that the distinction between a good and a service is declining. What is a good and what is a service? And we're going to drive that home in a moment. All right. Sorry. The last point is to negotiate the highest possible liberalization standards for products that cross goods and services boundaries. And here's the example I'd like you to think about. One of the things that trade policy has come to recognize is that much of the dynamics in even mature economies like the US comes from the expansion of small and medium-sized enterprises. And we understand now that one of the biggest accelerators of their growth is entry into the global trade and investment market, okay? So those are commonly agreed upon facts, at least among economists. I don't know where they stand in the White House. So those facts lead us to have to ask, well, what are the issues for them in expansion when they have to take their products and services globally much faster than in the past? So here's an example. Somebody comes up with that device I showed you, that biomedical sensor. They commercialize it. And it turns out that that product can be done by a third generation 3D printer accessing a communications network. So should they have to ship a large number of tattoos by FedEx, or should they have the right to send it as a digital packet file to an associated printer in another country? And should it make a difference for how the tariff and the market access rules work? That's the question that we have to start to answer in our international economic arrangements. So that what we're responding to are the real, if you would, facts on the ground, not the artificial distinctions in the rules. Trusted digital environment. For those of you who are trade experts, you'll recognize that horizontal trade disciplines basically say that regulators have to be subject to certain standards of behavior: transparency, non-discrimination, technology neutrality. So as long as they meet these standards, including least burdensome to trade, they have wide regulatory discretion. But they need to be specified for these new areas. Then building this issue, a trusted digital environment about privacy and security. So what we've suggested here is particularly to focus on binding enforceable soft rules. And these soft rules are basically ways of specifying how and what governments have to put in as basic regulations to guide an area such as privacy and security. For example, for cybersecurity, that countries could commit to using the risk management principle for guiding the formulation of regulations. They commit that will be the basis for their detailed regulations. That would be a principle, right? In the communications world, we said that they had to have a separate government decision-making body, and that they had to have interconnection rules that were meaningful. Okay, that's a soft law that had at least some degree of enforceability. But the countries are free to choose the specific mechanisms. So what Jonathan and I argue in great detail in the book is that, in fact, if you look at emerging international practices and some statements of principles that have been done in a totally voluntary level, like APEC principles, there is already the beginnings of being able to distill these soft laws for a trusted digital environment so that we can work from them to expand into a more enforceable system. This is not a one-shot fix. It's a framework for allowing an evolution of problem solving over time. And the point I want to get to most importantly is the third. We envision, in a sense, a change in the role that the trade system plays here. We don't see this as USTR out there fighting 1,000 battles by its own in the WTO or the regional dispute settlement mechanisms. It does that. It does it earnestly. It does it well. But those are limited tools. So what we envision instead is that the system is actually drawing in the pertinent national regulatory agencies of the countries in the club who are going to be bound by these soft laws, by trade scrutiny, but who are actually going to be setting a lot of the details by, in a sense, bilateral or plurilateral regulatory cooperation agreements, where they agree, as much as we did with the very imperfectly done transatlantic privacy deal, that they will have reciprocity, that they understand, an arrangement for allowing data flows, and as a result, they are helping to enforce the system. So this would mean for US regulatory agencies that the FTC and the FCC and others would actually have to be much more proactive in their view of global regulation, where it starts to be part of their incorporated, and they can say to, let's say, a company from Germany, the way that you are enforcing security rules don't fit the agreed upon standards that we have as we define them in the US. So it's not just up to USTR to do something in a trade complaint system, it's a regulatory matter, which is what the Europeans are doing to us. And suddenly you open the door to both bounding that discretion, but adding to enforceability in a cumulative way. Next point, we want those sorts of things like technical standards organizations. So what we want to do is to actually have, as the TPP started to do, a definition of the role of multi-stakeholder organizations in doing things like the equivalent of the underwriters labs, where there are definitions of what is the technical competence for a multi-stakeholder and what we do. So this leads to the last point, that what we are saying in trade terms is that we should have conditional most favored nation clauses for the trusted division of digital environment. That is, only benefits should flow to people who are members of the club. And that in turn means that only companies that are truly headquartered in the club get the benefits of the deals. So this means that in fact, if you built a patchwork, just imagine for a moment, from NAFTA out to bilaterals with Japan and England, and then maybe eventually you get something with the EU, that companies within the club would have the potential of having one-stop certification, having parallel regulatory systems, et cetera, and as companies truly headquartered in the region have those benefits. But companies that are not from the region are subject to whatever other set of regulatory scrutiny and certification you want to establish. If you did this with a significant part of the world market, about 40% of the world market, you would have established something that everyone has to think about whether they want to be in the club or not. And in that way, you start to get tipping behavior in the operation of companies on a global scale. And that, in the long term, is of course what we want, because we don't want to close the world economy. We want to open it, and we want to make it flexible. So this is a broad picture of what will be a very hard process step by step. It's a long-term vision, but we think that it starts to open the possibility of having a governance philosophy, responds to the technology, but also deals with some of the practicalities of regulation. So thanks very much for hearing us out. And Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, both of you, for that overarching and comprehensive framework. So I want to raise 2 points, and then we'll open it up. First of all, you're trying to do a couple of things in this book, which I think are important. But to me, the most important thing you're trying to do here, it's a little bit like if you're an alcoholic, the first thing you have to do is recognize you're an alcoholic. And in this case, the first thing we have to recognize is we don't have a framework. We don't have a framework to develop a framework. What the framework is secondary to the process and the need to develop a framework. And I think you've laid out a long way of what that framework could look like, and then there'll be nits and arguments about exactly. But to me, the most important takeaway of the book is, it is time to build the framework. And I don't see anybody doing it. I mean, you're doing it. We've done it in a report a couple of years ago called the Framework for Global Internet Policy, Resolving Global Internet Policy Conflict. So I think that's number one. Number two, the reason why I think that framework is so good, Peter and Jonathan, you alluded to the fact that, it started from the 50s to the 70s. We built this framework around goods trade. And a core component of it, in my view, is we have the laws and the rules, but we also have this thing where if you sort of violate that, you at least know you feel some guilt, like with a little kid doing something bad. And they know that they're not supposed to do it. So these countries, when they do these things around, we'll jack up tariffs to 80% or something, they know they're doing something bad, and there's some guilt. Cloud computing nationalization, there's no guilt around that, cybersecurity, encryption, source code, there's no guilt around that because there's no framework of saying, it's kind of like there's no super ego around this thing. And I think that's a core component of what you're trying to say is, let's make people feel guilty for doing these things. Now, sure, people will still do things when they're guilty, but they're going to do less. A third thing, and the thing one of the things I really like about this thing is your notion of the club, or you could call it the coalition of the willing. We've certainly argued that. You didn't want to call it that? No? I think that's a really super, super important point. Okay. Now, here's my couple of both question and maybe concern. To me, any framework has to be able to deal in a logical way with all the various kinds of things. So let me ask you one here, two. One would be right to be forgotten. You mentioned that in the book, and I read it initially, and I didn't read it carefully enough. But in our framework, if you want to be right to be forgotten, feel free. We don't think the policy makes any sense, but feel free to do it. It's up to you. But imposing it, as the French want to do, on the U.S., to me, is wrong. Okay. So I guess the question is, do you agree with that? And if so, how does your framework come to the conclusion that, well, this question, would your framework agree with mine that it's okay to do it in France, but not okay to do it out extraterritoriality? And if it's not okay, what's the logic in your framework?
So the answer is our first instinct would be that you're correct, and that the framework, by saying that there are principles that are enforceable, but there is national variation, means that extraterritoriality faces a special test for reasonableness. And therefore, unless France had a damn good reason that was compelling that they could show for extraterritoriality, which occasionally you can, right? That would be a case where the trade system actually had the ability to bring a complaint against France. And moreover, the US regulators could conceivably say that that violates the bilateral transatlantic framework that is nested within the trade framework. Now, how you do that in detail for anybody who's been a regulator is not straightforward and easy, but it's also a problem that regulators, my wife's a federal judge, and she always points out to me, people have impossible problems. The lawyers actually kind of resolve them over time, imperfectly, but better than elsewise. And I think that's the case here.
Okay. So a related one, a little different, but that's what a number of countries, including Europe, regions in Europe, and increasingly Latin America, they want to regulate OTT over the top, including video and telephony, as heavily regulated telephony. And the reason they do it is because they want to protect their domestic telcos against competition. How does your framework, can your framework sort of say, wait a minute, that's not the way to go, and there's some action?
We have a specific policy recommendation about that, yeah. Not on this list, because we had 14 of them. We thought we'd spare the audience.
So the club would essentially
Yes.
agree that that would be. All right, so my last point, and then we'll open it up to everybody. Here's my sort of biggest question or concern. I get your notion that you want to have some sort of level of convergence, so that the divergence in some of these spaces, particularly in privacy and security, is not as large. I'm quite skeptical that we can go down too far. You mentioned, for example, that people should adopt the OECD privacy guidelines, which I think are actually bad. I really think they're bad. Now, I think they maybe made sense 40 years ago, but I don't think they make sense in the digital era. I think they're way over prescriptive and way over restrictive. And here's my question. My question is, why doesn't we argue that jurisdiction stays with the data? Mm-hmm. So if you're Qualcomm or Microsoft or Citibank or Ford Motor Company and you're doing business in Europe, you take European person data and you bring it back to the US, or you put it in a data center in Zimbabwe or Nepal or wherever, you still have to comply with European law. It doesn't matter. So I guess, do you agree with that? And if so, how would that work all into both of your frameworks?
So we happen to cite you on that in the book.
Thank you. That was not a plan.
Yeah.
I should just know that.
And I guess unlike you, we would think that fits within the sort of OECD/APEC framework amended. And I see those as principles about a logic of contract law being applied at a global level. And I think that at that level of principles, that they kind of work.
Sure.
All right? And that's what a principle is. It's a causal theory that provides some boundaries and guidelines.
Okay. Well, good. Let's open it up. Rebecca. If you can say who you are, who you're with, and then we'll just right there, Rebecca.
Sure. Rebecca Arbogast, head of global public policy at Comcast NBC. So 2 questions that may or may not be related, I'm not sure. When you're talking about the framework, and I had this question in my mind when you were working with Charlie and Rita, a couple, 3-4 years ago, Does your model or your aspiration for the framework require creation of a new institution, a new platform? Is it housed in trade? Is it ad hoc? Period. That's the first question. The second question that may or may not be related is I'm reminded when we were all working together, we did a mutual recognition agreement on some equipment, and the pharmaceutical industry was side by side with us at the same time between the EU and the US. Is that an instance of a model that you think works for what you're talking about?
So as Jonathan started, the Aspen project, for those of you who weren't involved in it, tried to address many of these questions, and the proposal that we tried at the end implied in a new type of separate treaty arrangement that may have implied a new institution. What we've done is step back from that and say that the binding glue can actually be in trade agreements. And so you don't have to invent a new superstructure for this operation. You can meld it into trade agreements, and within it you can nest exactly the sort of example you just gave of mutual recognition type of working groups that work out the problem solving within it. And that it's that type of movement to specialized expertise groups accountable to the trade framework, and with a layer of the regulators having to intersect with each other, that becomes the way that you deal with the issue.
So like the reference paper.
That's exactly. The book focuses a lot on how the reference paper, for those of you who are not aficionados of this, the thing that was distinctive about how the WTO dealt with the telecommunications market when it really got down to trying to get broad network competition being authorized around the world and a variety of other issues for competitive telecom markets was that we recognized that having market access commitments were insufficient unless there were regulations that made the markets enforceable for competition. So we actually wrote a regulatory code as a set of commitments. Those were principles, what we would call enforceable soft law. Kelly Cameron's here. He sat in that room drafting them forever, right? And what
just a couple of years.
A couple of years of your life, and you look none the worse for wear for it, Kelly. And at the end, we had a framework that everybody could say, yeah, any competitive market would have these things in it.
Thanks.
Right bigger end here.
Jonathan Lovely with the FCC.
Yeah.
Peter, it was very considerate of you not to bombard us with all 14 or however many recommendations. However, I'd like to ask you to divulge what your OTT policy recommendation in the book is.
So,
The book, I think, is.
yeah, that's right. Scott is my guy. What we do is we suggest we draw a division as a starting point for thinking about it between linear and nonlinear audiovisual, and that by doing that it opens the space for stuff outside of traditional broadcast. And our view is that space can eat and deter and, so to speak, set boundaries around traditional linear broadcast arrangements. And in terms of trade, for those of you who are familiar with trade, audiovisual is one of these places that were the great exemptions in trade agreements that were big void areas. So walking into traditional broadcast is a really super hard area, but you can walk sort of around it.
Which is essentially what the EU has done through their television without frontiers.
That's what they're trying to do.
And its successors.
Right.
Thank you.
Move here.
I'm Ed Shahada with UPS.
Yeah.
So thank you. You don't need validation, but I would tell you that we're engaged in the last 10 months now in hand-to-hand combat and trying to work through this at the WTO. And hopefully at MC11, there will be a coalition of the willing that creates some kind of a progressive ministerial statement on a framework agreement for digital trade services and goods to kind of steer the ship to 30 or 40 countries that are willing to do. So, this is reality, it's happening, and I just wanted to say that. On a private sector standpoint, 3D printing, UPS has installed end-of-runway 3D printers around the world where we are now moving plastic beads and built building the things at the end of the supply chain rather than at the front of the supply chain. Again, validation that this is already happening, and it's speaking to Rick Acevedo. You know, he says e-commerce is going to happen with us or without us, and we just need to get on the game. So the problem with the WTO, as you know, it's 164 countries that need to. So we're trying to implement and embed this in NAFTA as well in the negotiations. But the lack of U.S. clarity is holding up. So that's a long statement, but the question at the end of that statement is, sometimes you need urgency or something to, what are your thoughts on what's it going to take to trigger the necessity for people to wake up and move on this?
Well, one of the things that has interested us, you know, we came here partly to flog the book, but partly to sort of get the responses of what people were saying. When we were working on this 5-6 years ago, the first part of the book was much more controversial. People say, what is this disruption that is going on? How is it changing it? This time around, we've got basic acceptance, sort of the kind that you were talking about, that these changes are well underway. Government agreements always lag. So it tends to take some kind of crisis for it to get kickstarted. We're hopeful to find something within this, and part of it is we're looking forward to create a long-term framework that's going to begin to move us in that direction.
Yeah, but you know, to the kickstarting point, so Jonathan, I think, has rightly said that we think there's a growing cumulative recognition that this really affects everybody. And the story of Iowa that we put up on a slide is really about what is occurring in lots of pieces of the economy. So there's that piece that's happening from the ground up. But I think that the issue that is still a couple years out, but it could be 6 months out, is in the end what the Europeans come to recognize that they have in common interest with the NAFTA countries in regards to China. That the China issue may be the sort of triggering event, not because it necessarily should be the basis for the trigger, but because that's the immediate problem at the moment. And you can't have a China strategy in the long term for the digital world unless you have your own anchor of governance. And one of the big problems, and this goes to Rob's comments earlier, one of the big problems that we have right now is that in the 90s, when communications competition and the internet were arising, the US had an answer. Anybody could look at what we were doing in the US and they could see a roadmap for what to do about these technological changes. And as a result, the US, in a sense, was saying to the world when they said this is complicated, we'd say, look at what we're doing. We're already making it work in practice. One of the problems right now is the US does not have a roadmap of its own. And therefore, the rest of the world looks at us and goes, well, what are you doing about it? And we come back with, well, we have a little initiative here, we have a little initiative there. And I think that's what Rob is saying in a way, that leadership also means you've got to get your act together at home, right?
Sure, absolutely. I'm going to go in the order ourselves, so yes, ma'am, right there.
I'm Michael Mullis. I'm the U.S. International Trade Commission. We're going to publish a digital trade report for USTR in a week or two. I was wondering if you could talk about the coverage of the TPP proposals, both the e-commerce chapter, but also the services chapter, the investment chapter, the telecom chapter, etc., and whether that package, given maybe fixing the carve-out for financial services, that package coverage is enough, or is it limited?
So first of all, to sell the book has a detailed analysis of TPP, and
I've done that too.
Right? But number two, the bottom line answer is TPP has a lot of good starting points, including on dealing with the role of MSOs in dealing with some issues about regulatory cooperation. It even has multi-stakeholder organizations, expert groups like technical standards organizations, or the Internet Engineering Task Force. It also has in it some seedlings of being able to do conditional most favored nation arrangements for regulatory purposes. So there are lots of things to work from TPP, but it's not sufficient for the long-term package that we need. But you're not going to get all of it at once, so that's okay. It was a good starting point.
And the distinction between GATT and GATS, the trade agreement environment makes this quite specific distinction between goods and services.
Right.
That doesn't seem to be serving us very well.
Right.
Could you comment on?
Right. So that's why we said, rather than try to suggest a rule, what we posed was a problem that you saw up here about 3D printing versus the use of UPS or FedEx, right? If we think about the problem, negotiators are good at thinking about, once they have the problem defined and people agree that this is something they got to deal with, starting to say, well, how do we put together the pieces so it works? But you got to define the problem set clearly enough that they can actually start to figure out a way of dealing with the challenge. And so we don't think we should get overly technical on that distinction early at this stage.
You had your hand up next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Kelly Cameron, formerly of the FCC, currently in private practice by myself. And I feel like I'm back in college because I've bought the book, but I've come to class without having read it, as apparently a lot of other people have. Going back to the WTO agreement, in retrospect it seems inevitable, but obviously at the time it wasn't. But now you look back and say, well, yes, we had liberalized and were about to adopt the 96 Act and open the market further, but there were, the EU was moving down the same path and lots of other countries were as well. So the market access piece was not so hard. And then, thinking about the reference paper, that also, in retrospect, seems almost inevitable because the EU was moving in the same direction, and we've had one case go to dispute settlement to enforce the reference paper, but nobody else has really raised much of a stink about it because everybody's moving in the same direction. I guess for a future framework for digital goods, digital DNA, I would make 2 points. One is that it seems like the WTO can't be the forum because of China, and for that matter because of the US administration, and maybe one day. But you could obviously come up with some sort of plurilateral agreement. But what about regulatory principles? I mean, as I said, looking back, it seems like, well, sure, everybody would recognize that you have to have interconnection based on commercial negotiations with an enforcement mechanism and cost-oriented rates and all that stuff. But are there things that, looking into your crystal ball, you think are the inevitable regulatory principles for this sector?
Yes, and moreover, the book tries to lay out showing where those routes are already emerging. They aren't perfect, and there's more disagreement than in telecom. But remember, in telecom, there was significant difference about what interconnection meant and a whole series of other things. So the purpose of a principle is to have a boundary condition, not to have uniformity, and a boundary condition that people actually recognize as, yes, this makes sense, to go to Rob's point that there's a kind of expectation that it's kind of work like that, right? So we make the argument in some detail in the book about that.
We're trying to push things in the right direction. We make no claim of knowing exactly where it's going to end up. But the details get worked out as the process continues. But you got to start it in a reasonable direction, or it's going to end up somewhere that has no hope.
So over here.
Jessica Sutton, now from World Resources Institute, but formerly assistant professor at CSU Computer. So I had a couple questions. So one is, so the rules are one thing, the evolving reality and enforcement is another. And so that raises two questions. One is right now, what are the current choke points or points of distortion that are being used in the absence of a sensible governance regime that you see as most important to either overcome or most important to change? So what are those distortions now? Second is, what are the potential future focal points for realistic, feasible enforcement? So what are the equivalent of the, I guess the customs and the border control inspections that you think this kind of regime actually feasible?
Right. So in terms of choke points today, people in this room could raise their hands offering you dozens. Cloud Computing Chapter spends a good deal of time on the combination of the of the false arguments about the economic benefits of localization of cloud facilities, but more deeply about three intersecting problems. Claims about competition policy dynamics, that globally scaled cloud computing, for example, is inevitably tipped to monopoly that will have all sorts of unfair behavior, which is a notion that we treat with considerable skepticism across the full range of cloud computing, as opposed to certain very specific subpoints. The second area is the privacy, and the third is really the security. Those arguments all are used as choke points. And so the point in the Cloud Computing Chapter is that if you think of cloud computing as a surrogate for much of the information architecture of the future, not the totality, but a good picture of it, you can't deal with the market access problem without addressing the security and privacy issues, because those will be used to choke it. Now, even after you get something like we're talking about, this industry won't be perfectly liberalized. And the analogy we use in the book is automobiles in the 50s and 60s, which globalized and had global production and distribution systems to some degree. But remember, there were all those local assembly plants that were required, right, for local value added and content. And so the purpose of the trade system was to start putting limits on that, and then eventually cleaning it up. So there's going to be some types of localization even with the rules. And the last point is trade plus regulatory mutual enforcement systems give you more flexible tools.
You know, the difference though between autos and cloud, Peter, is first of all, the number of jobs you get from autos is much bigger than cloud.
Right.
And second, the cloud is a capital input to the rest of the supply.
I completely
autos
agree.
are a consumer good, and
Right.
it doesn't matter if you jack up the price.
Right. All I'm just saying is that
No, I'm saying I think it might be at one level an easier case to make intellectually, whether it's politically.
good point.
One of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is we have a cyber chapter, but we take it from a very different point of view. We really focus on the security and not on the hacking and the fake news and all of that. So that most of the chapter deals with the case study of SWIFT and sort of how that
They
evolved.
tell what SWIFT is.
The foreign the group in Brussels that manages foreign exchange transactions among banks in the world, and it is a very unique MSO in that there are banks in it, there are central banks in it, and it has had a couple of instances of being broken into lately, but by and large it's been quite successful in terms of evolving a system, and we use it to show some opportunities and lessons about how you might begin to do that.
I mean, the reason why we do SWIFT, as Jonathan said, is that here is an international institution that's owned by the largest banks in the world, essentially, collectively, under a formula that demands that shareholding by the banks be distributed by shares of the global foreign exchange networks, so that there's a sort of a club built into the governance of the system. And then it is an expert organization, and it is responsible through the Central Bank of Belgium, which oversees it, to the Bank of International Settlements which represents the central banks, to see if it is behaving in a way that is neutral and effective. And so it's a great example of building specialized technical groups.
Doesn't all that get blockchain and Bitcoin?
It may. We're indifferent, but it's worked for the 40 years of growth of foreign exchange to date, which is sort of a miracle that it did.
Yeah, no, I know, I'm just trying to go in order, but I can make sure. Okay, so Reed and then.
Hi, so I'm Reed Hunt. I'm an admirer and friend of the authors. I'd like to ask you all to comment about current events. I will summarize them as follows, and as always, you can challenge my summary if you want. I would say that trade is accused of hollowing out the middle class in the United States and intensifying income inequality and general inequity in our society, and the digital economy is charged with the exact same crimes, and you've written a book about these two satanic forces at the same time. What do you think of that?
You're always so uncontroversial.
So, the answer is, yeah, this is a hard challenge, but I actually think that we're sort of in a midpoint about at least the digital side of the story. And when I say a midpoint, the first part of the book makes an argument that's just broader than it's changing farming and it's changing oil production. It's arguing that the innovation system in the U.S. is changing, in that the number of places that will actually be centers of innovation and organize more like some of the dynamics you associate with the big tech cities in the United States is going to spread. That the Iowa example is not a random example, it's happening in many places. And that has had an effect that we've seen very powerfully at the grassroots that is not yet translated to national politics, which is more and more cities are organizing themselves to recognize that there are innovation hubs built around a renovation of their traditional areas of expertise, and that those innovation hubs, by the nature of digital dynamics, have to go global. Among other things, a big part of the change in the world economy, we think, is going to be increased customization of products and services. And when you do that, you want a global feedback loop, which means you need A, to go global, but B, you need to actually have interaction with the customers on real time. So what's occurring is that there's a change going on at the municipal level. And that municipal level change hasn't translated yet into the paralysis that we see in Congress and in the national presidential politics. But I think the moment is there. And Reed, I know you well enough to know you like big historical analogies. So let me give you one. Think that you're in the 1880s, 1890s in the United States, and the railroad and the telegraph have allowed for the creation of the first truly national corporations who disrupt the regional economies around the United States, cause a huge backlash against the nationalization of the U.S. economy, and out of it, we could have tried to put up barriers across state lines, but instead we got the progressive movement of regulation at a national level in the Interstate Commerce Commission, etc. So I think that actually, if we take a long-term perspective, that there are forces here that work better. But the big structural change in governance and trade is trade changes its role to be much more of an umbrella organization where these types of specialized expert groups and regulatory arrangements are much more the heart of the action, and trade is sort of where there's an accountability mechanism at the top that helps give it some meaning. You have to be serious about it because something bad might happen if you really violate the rules wildly.
I want to go to Dave. Before I do that, Reed, this to me is an example of how Washington thinking can get so off track by fundamentally bad analysis. When you really look at the data and the evidence on the growth of income inequality, the last thing it's related to is large tech firms. So if you look at Moretti's work, for example, where he shows, are you better off being a low-wage worker in Silicon Valley or Seattle or San Diego,
controlling for cost of living, or better off being in St. Louis or Cincinnati? You're better off being a low-wage worker in a high-tech hub. You will do better. So, this whole notion that high-tech firms lead to inequality is simply not true. Here's another interesting factor. Jonathan Rothwell's done this work when he was at Brookings looking at the CPS data. Now he's the chief economist at Gallup. There are more, if you look at who are the 1%ers in the US, there are significantly more dentists than software engineers. Who are more the 1%ers? There are significantly more doctors than corporate managers and CEOs. The 1%ers in the US are the professional class and the financier class. That's really who's driving, and sports stars and those people like that. It's not really coming out of the big corporate sector. So, and that's a pitch for our book that's coming out, which unfortunately you have to wait for until February, from MIT Press, called Big is Beautiful, rebutting the mythology of small business, that looks at all this evidence, including around large tech firms, and shows that really when you look at the evidence, people are sort of looking for fingers to point, people to blame, and rather than look at some other things really around political economy and power, they're blaming technology. So, Dave.
Well, at a risk of dumbing down this conversation, it seems to me there's one company, not to pick on a company, that you could write a book about how your book impacts that company. And that is Amazon, who is the perfect blending of goods and services, from cloud services to consumer goods as a subscription, to content delivery, and now in the grocery business itself. How are you going to take, how do you anticipate putting a regime or regimes in place that can help anticipate or manage companies that have such complex dynamics? And is that the trend of the future?
Yeah. So Amazon is the case that we punted on in the book. So you've caught us. And we punted on in the sense that we spent a lot of time thinking about, and the book has half of a chapter on Qualcomm as an example of what's it mean to be a technology company in this changing environment, strengths and weaknesses, and therefore policy issues that you should think about. Did the same with Monsanto, interestingly enough. And we spent a lot of time on Google and other platform companies. Amazon, and then on specialized producers like biomedical. But Amazon, I have to confess, I still haven't figured out if they're truly a global company, or if they are really a North American company. And because at least, and Jonathan and I went back and forth on this, and we couldn't resolve the problem. So we decided that while it is exactly the sort of problem that needs to be talked about next, we didn't have an answer. So I'll own up to it.
We do talk a fair amount about AWS, their cloud operation, which is of course gigantic. And that's the part of Amazon that most people don't see. But it is a profit generator, and it's, we're trying to figure it out.
Right. But in the fundamentals, it's really not, it goes to the question of, should you be allowed to package, and this is one recommendation as well. Should there be a set of trade commitments that allow you to answer this question? Does the market access commitment allow you to blend services with goods in a flexible way to have market access? And the example we use in the book is not Amazon, but it was Google in China, where some of the ways that Google might have entered China was through leveraging its Google Maps and GPS system to related information or Uber-style services. And the problem was that China blocked the use of Google Maps, right? Thus blocking entry into the related market. And the same thing can happen to Amazon if they don't have the right to facilities flexibility and the right to integrate services with goods delivery. So the package is right, but what I don't know is what I think about Amazon as a competitor in detail. So that's why I can't answer.
I think we have time for one last question. Sorry, go back to Elliot. Oh, did you have your hand up here? you right here?
did.
You actually had your hand up first, so let's do both questions at once, and then we'll do an answer.
And we'll do short answers. Go
Okay,
ahead.
I'm Valerie DaCosta, formerly of the World Bank, and before that, a trade negotiator at the WTO and an ICT regulator for my home country of Singapore. And of course, a friend and admirer. I was wondering if in the course of the research for the book, or in the book itself, you've surveyed other countries that might be starting to put together a little bit of a national roadmap or municipal roadmap that we could use as building blocks, and also as a marker for which countries to reach out to for being part of this club. I just returned from Singapore, and I know these issues are on the front page of the newspaper every day. So I was wondering if you've done a little bit of that outreach.
Thank you. Elliot?
Okay, Elliot Maxwell, and my apologies to the authors of whom I'm great fans. I had a conflict, so I'm late and missed everything, so this question is clean. It's an area that has gotten much less attention, and that's the area that I'm playing with right now, which is digital learning. And one of the questions about digital learning and its impact over the next 20 years will be about mutual recognition of some form of credentialing. And it gets intertwined with regulation at the national level and protectionism among institutions, yada, yada, yada. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that particular area and ways in which one can encourage the development of a mutual recognition regime that actually functions, as opposed to one that claims to function but doesn't.
Okay, you have 2 minutes for each answer.
Valerie, we have binders of outlines and policies of lots of countries, and Jonathan and I have spent the last 3 years in a group headquartered out of Tokyo that's been talking about these models. And we actually spent a lot of time looking at Singapore, so yes, and we agree with you about the point. Elliot, in another one of my many dubious roles in life, I spent the last year as the provost of my university, and continuing in expanding our degree options in the future. And to me, some of these mutual recognition of credentials is more likely to be solved by the fact that universities across the world, for very selfish reasons, are going to essentially dual degree systems at the professional degree level. And so what will happen is that you'll see a trend that the National University of Singapore and UC San Diego will have a degree that they offer that you'll walk away with 2 degrees at the end of the same process. And so you'll have certification in the sense of the right professional coming out of the actual graduate degree process. Now, whether we actually come to a point where we can get past the ABA and all the other, medieval guilds that limit recognition, I don't know. But I will say that the credentialing issue, I think, is going to change because of online learning dynamics.
Elliot, I got to stop you, sorry. Okay, maybe you can continue. Respectful.
We do the same thing, and it turns out the integration is still difficult. We've had a dual degree program with LSE for some time, but the idea of having 2 universities' names on one diploma is anathema to all.
So you give 2 diplomas.
Or you could do what we propose, which is get rid of diplomas altogether and focus on certification.
Right, you could.
And separate out education from certificates.
And that's another barrier.
Which is, I think, a much better model. Particularly since I'm paying tuition for my son right now, noting how many classes he has to take, that even though he knows them, because the university has to fill enough slots to get all the students to it. So you would never do that in San Diego, would you? Or at USC?
Never.
Never. Okay. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. I thought this was a fascinating discussion. Again, encourage you to buy the book. I don't think it's that expensive. It's,
well, if you go with Kindle, it is $12.95.
Yeah.
Wow.
If you order directly from Oxford University Press, and there are flyers on the back, you can get a 30% discount. They ran through all 15 copies that Amazon bought, so that it's back ordered there.
You've now talked about our future sales prospect in total.
All right, so if you all go and buy it on Amazon, you can move your rank up from 47,094 to 46,000. Our goal is authors on Amazon. So please join me in thanking
Thanks all for coming.
Thank you indeed.
Remember the